I usually ask you to leave comments, and I do read them, but I also wanted to take some time to read them out loud for other people who aren't going to scroll through all my comments, and maybe there's some lessons to be learned, some tidbits of wisdom. So let's dive right in. The G9 Mark II is definitely too expensive compared to a full-frame S5X brand new. You can even get a full-frame S1 brand new, which is even more professional than the S5 2X at a similar price. So that's kind of my point with the G9 Mark II, saying it's too expensive. Yeah, expensive is relative to everything else on the market. So when you compare it to Sony and Canon and Nikon and other Lumix cameras, the G9 Mark II, that original price point was pretty high, pretty steep. The moment it came down $500, I jumped right on it, and that's what you're looking at now. Nice talks. I subscribe along to your channel. I like to see that you create more of the channel with great level talks. Keep doing it. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, it's fun to talk about cameras, equipment, techniques, filmmaking, all that stuff. It's what I love to do, and I like to share my opinions on it, as well as talk to others about it and see what works for them. I think only time will tell. I've been an amateur filmmaker doing this for a hobby, not to earn money. For nearly 22 years, I have worked with so many camera brands, but Nikon as a filmmaking tool was never my weapon of choice. Also my point with Nikon. Yes, they make great cameras for photography, and yes, some of their new cameras offer great, incredible video features. 8K, 60 frames a second, internal RAW recording, really cool stuff. But it's not an ecosystem that's ever played nice in terms of cinema, video, broadcast, and all the hybrid styles that have become very popular over the last decade. Sony, Canon, Lumix, they all got wind of this pretty early on, and it's taken a while for Nikon to actually catch up, and that's why I just think they're not that relevant for video content creators, independent filmmakers. They're still very popular with photographers, rightfully so. Nikon makes great photography cameras, but they're only just starting now to scratch the surface when it comes to taking video seriously. And of course, that's reflected in their acquisition of Red, which could be a great move for the future. We'll see how that plays out. Only time will tell. Hello, sir. It is a request from my side that if possible, can you try adapting lenses to the G9 Mark II to see how the autofocus works? As we know, in the S5 Mark II, it works amazingly. I heard that the Viltrox adapter works with continue autofocus for adapting EF lenses. So I did try this. I don't have the Viltrox adapter, but I do have a Metabones speed booster, and I was curious. I haven't shot that way in a long time. My bread and butter back in the day was the speed booster with the Sigma 18-35. Classic combo for the GH5, and it worked great for manual focus. But once I found some Lumix native lenses that work great, things like the 10-25, the 25-50, the lens you're looking at right now, the 9mm lens, all these native lenses, the autofocus for photography works so well, and now with video autofocus actually being phase detect and having all that great continuous autofocus that we've desperately wanted for so long on these Lumix systems, it's just been kind of organic for me to keep using the native glass. I haven't even thought about my speed booster in years probably, but I did test this out, and unfortunately for me, I could not get the Metabone speed booster plus the 18-35 to work with the G9 Mark II. I did update the firmware on the Metabones, so that should all be playing nice, and I think I'm up to date on the G9 Mark II firmware, so I don't know what the issue is. The camera can definitely see my face and tracking, but it just can't set the lens to the right focus distance. It's probably some kind of compatibility issue. I've had this speed booster now for years and years, and of course the G9 Mark II is one of the latest, newest Micro Four Third cameras, so I kind of expected it wouldn't play all that nice, but maybe if you try something else like the Viltrox, maybe that'll work. I just don't have a way to adapt electronic lenses to the Micro Four Third system in a way that's a more modern adapter. I've gone with the native glass, and I'm really happy. I don't really miss the speed booster days all that much, although it would be cool if it worked. The Nikon Z9 outsold the Sony A1 4-1. It's over for Sony when Nikon releases autofocus red camera. People buy cheap FX cameras only because of the autofocus, and red cameras are expensive. I wouldn't be surprised if the Nikon Z9 outsold the Sony A1. Those are photography first cameras. So in the world of photography, it makes sense that Nikon would win. But in the world of video and content creation and hybrid production, independent filmmaking, YouTube, influencer, the whole world of social media as it's been unlocked over the last decade, it's no surprise that Sony seems to be the more popular choice in that world. And that's reflected in the actual market share that Sony has been able to gobble up and take away from Nikon. Canon still has their spot, but Sony has made waves very, very quickly in this new world of hybrid content creation. If you are a professional photographer and you love Nikon, please, by all means, keep shooting Nikon. It makes no difference to me. But I do find that in photography, things tend to be more solo. You have an individual photographer working on a project. Yes, there are times where you might have a team of photographers all doing the same thing, but I think that's far more common in the world of video and filmmaking, where you have multiple cameras covering a scene from different angles, and you want all those cameras to be similar and easy to integrate with each other. So it's not surprising when Sony has their cinema cameras, like the Venice, and then you have someone who comes in with an FX3, an FX30, an FX6, maybe an A7S III. All these cameras in the Sony ecosystem play nice with each other. They all use the same lenses, the same mount. It just works really, really well compared to Nikon, which is kind of just a photography camera that works great if you're a solo shooter, and it doesn't really matter what it's compatible with because you're doing all the work yourself. In a video environment, it's a little bit different, and so it makes sense to me that Sony has just become so popular recently. I think they need to lower the price, considering you can get the full-frame S5 2X at similar price point. Exactly my point. Micro Four Thirds, if the selling point is that it's smaller, it's cheaper, it's lighter weight, you need to hold true to those things. That's the great pitch, right, for Micro Four Thirds, that everything's smaller, more compact, it's cheaper, so stick with that. Don't make a bigger, heavier, more expensive Micro Four Thirds camera, because all of a sudden you start wondering, well then what's the difference between the full frame and the Micro Four Thirds, and if I can get a sensor that's 4 times as big, I might go with that instead. Yes, the lenses tend to be heavier for full frame, but you can also get lightweight full frame lenses. I think each of these sensor sizes is best when it plays to its strengths and its advantages. I like Micro Four Thirds because I can get things like shallow depth of field, but I still have all those great features like it fitting in a smaller footprint. Stick to that. Micro Four Thirds, don't try and get too big, stay small, because these full frame cameras are getting quite small and quite compact. And cheap. RJ Johnson says, looks good and compact. Do you use the XLR adapter for the left side hand grip, or do you support the camera with the left hand under the battery? So yeah, with my rig, it's very center weighted. I don't like to build long, deep rigs that I'd put on my shoulder. That's not quite how I shoot. I like to keep everything handheld. So keeping that center of gravity relatively center, if that makes sense, is how I prefer it. So the battery underneath, the LCD right up top, and the way I hold the camera is my left hand underneath the battery so I can still have access to the lens to manual focus if I need to. And then of course I just hold the camera with the right grip. I wonder if that bothers left-handed people. I'm right-handed, so it doesn't really matter to me, but I'm sure there's probably a way to make left-handed people more comfortable, or you just get used to it. I don't know, I'd love to hear it. Once upon a time properly starts with once. Jim Gennard departed Red. I had a feeling, and it became true, that Red was slowly losing money, momentum, and they were heading slowly to extinction, so the new owner and CEO sold it before he lost even more money. I was one of the first Red 1 original camera owners, and Red treated me like crap after I paid them their $40,000 all at once for the Red 1 with all the accessories. I was one of the first 500 buyers that should receive. Okay, so this person is upset because of how they were treated in the past by Red, and that's one thing that is true for Red users. It seems like there's people who love Red and love how they're treated, and there's just as equally as many people who are frustrated and annoyed by all the limitations and delays and back orders and just feeling like they're not being properly taken care of. Now, this is something that I think is probably true for almost any company, not just Red. Maybe it's a little bit more easy to spot or a little bit more transparent with how they treat their customers because there's just less of them. But if you think of any company, sometimes you'll be really lucky with support and other times it'll be abysmal. And depending on who you're talking to, depending on the occasion, it can really depend. So I think while a personal experience is definitely going to sour an individual to a brand, you kind of look at the broader ecosystem, the broader marketplace, and you say, okay, well, these cameras are being used. People do like them. People do shoot with them. They're having success. So there must be something there. I wouldn't take one person's horror story as fact, although I do believe it. I think it probably did happen. Way back in the day, I had a pre-order for the Red 1 and ended up not fulfilling it just because the Red 1 had so many issues as far as overheating and compatibility, and it was just kind of a frustrating camera to work with. There are a lot of people who made great things with the Red 1, but I think all of them will admit it was quite a headache. And then by the time the Epic and Scarlett came around, they were kind of outside my price point. We weren't really looking at doing that level of work anymore, and I opted to just use the G1, the 5D Mark II, those types of DSLR hybrids, which I think in hindsight ended up being a great choice. If you live in a place where the market can afford red rates and you can recoup all that expense buying those cameras, then great. But I've never lived in a market like that where I would have always been going a little bit more in debt just to keep up with the latest and greatest, and I think it would have been an unwise choice at the time. Nikon is last on my list of a camera I'd ever shoot. I'd shoot Pentax over a Nikon. Interesting, and I would be curious to know a little bit more about that. Is that because of video or photography? It really depends on the user and the environment and what you're trying to accomplish. But I tend to agree. I did own a Nikon D600 because at the time it was about the cheapest full frame camera you could get, and it did have video features, but I ended up selling it and getting rid of it just because it didn't work the way I like to work. There's those extra video features that the Lumix system has been great at that Nikon and even Canon and even Sony have been very late to embrace. Some of the extra things that I personally like in the experience of using a Lumix camera as opposed to anything else. So while yes, Nikon does have good features, it's pretty low on my list as well. But we'll see, maybe that'll change now that they've got red in their back pocket. Nikon's video problems were not about their cameras or optics, it was about how they focused. I get the feeling you read some stuff for this and really missed some of the subtle points in this debate. There's a lot of backstory here that's missing from the Wikipedia pages. So I'm not really sure what this is supposed to intend or imply. The Nikon video problems about how they focus. Yeah, so Nikon focus rings turn the opposite directions for some others, so that can be an issue when you're trying to use focus rings and do anything in more of a cinema package, and maybe it's just how people get used to as well, just the comfort of it. You can actually switch that now, so the newer Nikon cameras let you change the direction of the focus ring, which is quite nice and helpful if that's a feature you need. But I don't know that that's the only reason Nikon had problems. I think it's just because they've been so exclusively focused on photography, and that's fine, but in the world of content creation, it's more than just photos nowadays, and these companies kind of figuring out that video is a piece of the puzzle. Things like vertical video for social media are so valuable and so important. That's why I love things like Lumix, which lets you film open gate. If you don't know that, you can watch some of my videos on it where you can film horizontal and vertical at the exact same time by using what's called open gate or anamorphic shooting. It's incredibly powerful, the video features on these hybrid cameras. And so when you're looking at apples to apples, comparing what am I going to get for what price point, me personally, I end up going with what's most convenient and makes my life easier, not more complicated. I don't always need bigger files or more resolution. That's helpful and nice in certain situations, but it's the whole package. It's how it all fits together and fits into my workflow. One of my biggest gripes with Sony, I haven't really talked about this a lot, but it comes to mind. The Sony file organization, just when you copy a card and having M4 root and clip and all these folders and subfolders, and the folder structure alone is very irritating to me for Sony. And the same is true of Canon back in the day with MXF files, and there's compatibility and you're wondering, okay, which of these clips do I need? Whereas the Lumix system, you plug in the card and you have your JPEGs, your MOVs, and your RAW. It all just is what you would expect. It's what you need. You don't have extra random miscellaneous metadata package files. It's just clean and simple. And it's a small little thing, but things like that really do impact when you're shooting day after day, week after week, time after time, copying cards, organizing files. You can make it work with any system, but I always end up going with what ends up being the least amount of a headache and just the easiest stress-free. In the photography world, Nikon is a giant. They have some of the best lenses in the world. Canon in the photography world is just as big, but spend gobs of money on advertising and new products. They release more cameras per year with added features, etc. Nikon has a dedicated base of customers because they really listen to feedback and directly incorporate that into the next camera. Okay, so this goes on talking about how Nikon is so great. Can you imagine the quality and codecs we would have if they had been held back so long because of Red holding their patent? So yes, I've said this and I will continue to say it, Nikon is great for photography, but when you look at market share and you wonder why Sony and Canon are so popular, it makes sense to me that it's because of things like full frame mirrorless, embracing video features, great exceptional autofocus, kind of first to the game with Sony and Canon there. So having those features mattered more in terms of earning market share, well, yeah, I'm glad Nikon still caters to their user base. And there's no problem with having a variety of brands and companies, and you can have your exclusive boutique companies that just do one thing really, really well. You have companies like Blackmagic and Fuji and Olympus that all have very, very excited and enthusiastic users and consumers. I'm just usually talking about Nikon in the context of why things are the way they are in the current landscape. When you look at it and go, why? Nikon used to be really popular and they don't seem as popular anymore. What happened? That's what I'm diving into. I have not saying that they're bad cameras or that they're not good for photography, and I'm not even saying they have bad video features. I'm just saying all the changes they've been making recently are recent, and they would be in a much better place had these been done a little earlier, a little sooner. They could have embraced things like hybrid and content creation and video production earlier and been more popular, because I think everyone would be happy to have those types of features. Nikon has been and is still one of the dominant brands in the sports industry, which is multi-billion-dollar industry and has been historically dominant in the photojournalism industry that has been tested as super reliable in war-torn countries. So yes, I agree. I don't know who you're arguing with or what point you're trying to make, because I say as much in my videos when I talk about these things, but it's the why are they not as popular? That's what I'm trying to explain. I get that they're great for sports, action, war, great journalism, photojournalism. Have your Nikons, totally fine. I have nothing against that. I'm not saying Sony or Canon are even better in those environments or that Lumix is better in those. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just talking about why things are popular, why we are where we are, and what happened to get us there along the way. This was very interesting and deep. I really appreciate the in-depth information delivered here. Now I understand more than I did before. Thank you. Well, you're welcome, Keith Brown. I appreciate it. That's a nice comment to read. Another great video. Excellent, Foresight Films LLC. Wonder what's going to happen to the EF and RF mounts. All gone. Change to Z mount. So this could happen, and it'd be quite a shakeup for Red. Red has always worked really well with Canon for whatever reason. I think just being a fan. From what I understand, Jim Gennard back in the day doing the Oakley marketing, commercial production, photography, that kind of thing, always shot on Canon, and at a certain point realized, hey, we should have really good, digital film cameras. Let's go start this company called Red. And so I think it's always been a natural fit to have Canon and Red working together for whatever reason. Just they both seem incredibly popular. People really like their products, and they're certainly some of the most widely used lenses in terms of the EF mount back in the day. Now it's the RF mount, and Red worked hand in hand with Canon throughout all that. So switching to the Z mount would be a very interesting move, because it would unlock this whole cinema world that Nikon lenses never really had access to before. I'm sure there's cameras out there that shoot cinema projects that have the Z mount, but it's just not common. It's not something in-house by Nikon. It's been just their photography cameras that have video features. So when you're talking about professional cinema, video production, broadcast, whatever it might be, it's definitely on the right track for Nikon to have their Z mount in more places where their lenses can be used beyond just photography or in hybrid cameras. But I do wonder what impact that's going to have on the Red users, because most of those people have been shooting Canon glass for a long, long time. Again, that pairing just went hand in hand. My guess is that there'll still be ways to do whatever you want. So if you want Red cameras with EF mounts or RF mounts, those will still be available. You can buy them on the used market, and we'll see if the new mounts go exclusively Z. Of course, they'll probably still be PL, and you can adapt different mounts to the Z mount. So I think it'll just be a more compatible, flexible ecosystem, hopefully. But who knows? We'll see. Maybe they'll really lock it down and say you have to buy our Z lenses if you want to use this camera, and I'm sure there'll be people who find a way around it. Thanks for sharing your experience. Did you ever have the G9 Mark II overheat? No, I haven't had the G9 Mark II overheat. Now, I live in Phoenix, so it does get quite hot here, and some of my productions do take place in the summer, so we'll see. We're closing in on that season. Things are starting to warm up, but I haven't had any issues just yet with the G9 Mark II. No overheating warnings, issues. I've seen a couple people online say they've had maybe some problems here and there, and I don't really know what circumstances would create that environment, but I will definitely let you know if it becomes a problem. I've never had an issue on the GH6. Now that does have the built-in fan for cooling. I don't know how much that's actually doing. It's hopefully doing something. They put it in for a reason. But that also came out at a time where all of a sudden all the cameras just started overheating. I don't know why this became a thing. It was really Canon and the R5 that kicked that off, but then even Sony cameras are all overheating now, and that's a general statement. I shouldn't say they're all overheating, but in general, I have problems with the A7 Mark IV because it sometimes overheats for whatever reason. This was not an issue, and now it is. Of course, things have gotten better with higher frame rates and better codecs and bit rates and all that stuff, so it kind of makes sense, but it also kind of doesn't, because I don't know why you would release a camera that once it overheats, it basically becomes useless. So I'm very glad that the GH6 has the fan and is never overheated, but I also wonder how much of that was actually necessary versus just kind of a, hey, we did this just so you give that peace of mind. We'll see with the G9 Mark II if it ends up being a problem for me, but so far, so good. Finally, I'll end with this one. Lumix needs to release a set of 1.2 Nocticrons, a 12, an 18, a 25, to join the 42.5. I think 2024, 2025 will be big for Lumix. They have all the ingredients, they just have to execute well on the next bodies. That is the biggest problem with Lumix when it comes to their full frame mount, the L mount. So the S cameras from Lumix are full frame, and if you want full frame glass, you need all new stuff. Micro Four Thirds will not work, right? So Micro Four Thirds has been around for a long time. We have tons and tons of glass. I do agree that it'd be nice to have more of those 1.2s. So I have the 42.5 1.2 lens. Beautiful, beautiful lens. I wish there were more. I wish there were faster Micro Four Third lenses in these focal ranges. I think a 12, an 18, and a 25 would be very nice to have. But that is the problem with full frame Lumix, is that the lens selection just isn't there yet. The more they can push with those lenses and actually making glass that people like, they want to use, some of the new lens tech is really, really impressive, really sharp, really fast, great glass. You got some zooms that are looking excellent these days from Nikon and Sony and Canon. So just having more selection, especially in more of that premium style where it's faster but still lightweight. I don't want giant massive lenses just for the sake of getting it to a 1.2. You gotta, it's always a balance, but I think the 42.5 1.2 is a great example of what's possible with Micro Four Thirds. And so I would appreciate more Micro Four Thirds lenses, but I would just as equally like to see some full frame Lumix lenses, a little bit faster, a little bit more unique or novel. I think one of the biggest reasons that Sigma 18 to 35, that's old now, but when that came out and it just kind of shocked and shook everyone up with a, oh, this is cool, a Super 35 or APS-C lens, that's 18 to 35, that's an interesting focal range, but very useful, very practical. You get wide and kind of more or less close up. At a 1.8, that's a very, very fun, interesting, great lens, sharp, detailed, all the things you would want out of it. And having more things like that, I think are just fun to play around with. That's why I love the Lumix 10 to 25. That Leica lens is great because it's such a useful focal range and at a fast aperture of 1.7. So more options like that are always good. And it's just a matter of the science and engineering and determining if there's a market for it and if people will buy it. But I think I'm at least one of those customers that would buy some cool new glass if there was something a little bit more different than your typical 24 to 70 2.8. Those tried and true. You need them for kind of being the workhorse to get a lot done, but they're also kind of boring and bland. So more unique, interesting stuff, a little bit wider. I like the 20 millimeter full frame. That focal length looks great. This is a 9 millimeter, so it would be an 18 equivalent for full frame. I think those lenses and looks are more unique and more fun to play around with. But let me know what you think. More comments, keep them coming. I'm happy to read them, because I'll respond to them, but I'll also respond to them.